So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for not getting too late yesterday from the party. We're gonna talk about how can you authenticate in Drupal 8. We'll compare it about how it works as well in Drupal 7, so we can see how it goes from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 as well. And a small introduction about me. I work at Lullabot. I'm a Drupal developer. Lullabot is a development, strategy, and design company specialized in Drupal. We also use other technologies, but most of the sites we build are, the backend normally is built in Drupal, plus something else, normally. And in the Drupal community, I maintain some modules, and I attend to these geek events. So anyway, moving on. So we're going to mention these two concepts over the whole session. So has anybody ever heard about what authentication and authorization are? It's the first time I read about them was at the Symfony book. If you haven't read that book, I really recommend it, even though you don't need to do any Symfony development. It's just a really nice programming book because it's based on best practices, so it's really nice. So I'm going to tell a story about what authentication and authorization works. This is But. It's a posh, cheesy, horrible club that is in Madrid. And I hate this place, really hate it. Because when I was at school and when everybody wanted to go to this place, because it was the place to go on Friday and Saturday, but so all my friends would go there. The girl I liked at that moment would go there as well. And when you get to the door, you find this really friendly guy, which is called the bouncer, and the bouncer just he wants your ID, right? He wants to see who you are, and actually the act of you showing your ID to the bouncer, that's authentication. It's just telling you to someone or something who you are. In Drupal, this would be your username and password, for example. So I had a problem with this because you had to be 16 years old to get into this place. So that's when we get to the second step, which is the authorization. The problem with me was that my birthday is on the 31st of October. So when we were in September, October, around like 70 or 80% of my class at school could get into that place, and I couldn't because I wasn't 16 years old. So when I would get to the bouncer and I would show the bouncer my ID, the bouncer would check if I had the permission to get into this place, and that's authorization. Once the authentication system know who you are, then the authentication system will check if you have the permission to pass that check. So typical answers I would get from the bouncer would be, I'm sorry, you are not 16 years old, so get out. Or this is not your ID, get out. Or this ID is fake because you pasted something else with a different birth date here, so get out. Anyway, I didn't have the permission to get into that place. And that's authorization. In Drupal, this would be the set of roles and therefore permissions that you have. So can you do this now that I know who you are? That would be authorization. So that would be my first experience with what the hell is a 403, because I couldn't get into this place until I was 16 years old. This is a screenshot from the Symfony book about these two concepts, a little bit more technical, but anyway, we're gonna cover some of these authentication methods, which are some of them in Drupal core, some others are in Contrib modules. And then the second system, which is the authorization system, which also exists in Drupal, and we also had it in Drupal 7, just that it's obviously structured in a different way. Hey, no, it's not here. I think I messed it up. Oh, stop. No, don't do this to me. Okay, my laptop hang, I think. Okay, so let's move on. So in Drupal 8, since like 6 or 7 months ago, Drupal 8 incorporates a modular authentication system, and the modular term comes because you are able to implement different authentication systems. There are some of them that are in core, a couple of them, and then there are others that we are implementing in Contrib modules as well. But basically what do they do is that you get a request object. This object comes from the request HTTP request component from Symfony. It's just an object that contains the headers and all the request variables that you had in PHP, but into an object. So basically the authentication methods will just look into the headers to see if they can extract a user, a Drupal user. So they will try to somehow get data from the request and see if there is a matching user in the Drupal database against that request. So they'll receive a request object, and they may return either a null value or a user object, not the global user object that we see in Drupal 7, but an actual Drupal, an actual user object from a user class. There's no global user object anymore in Drupal 8. These are the two that come in core. Cookie is the default one, and it's really simple. Basically, it will just check if you have a cookie ID in your session, and if it does, then Drupal has a table called session. Perhaps you've seen it sometimes, and this table has like your session ID and who you are and some extra metadata like your current session information. And basic auth, you may have seen this one when, for example, you access an intranet or a protected website, and you get this pop-up that asks for a username and password. Well, that's basic auth. It's really simple. You just send username and password. They are encoded in base 64, and it's just username, password. You encode that, and then you get what you need to send in the headers. It's very simple to test with. There's an example here of basic auth. This tool we're seeing here is it's a client for Chrome browser. It's called Dev HTTP client. It's really handy because in this example, for example, here is the request I'm making to a local Drupal 8 site I've built. This is the method we are using. In this case, we are requesting the first node of this Drupal site, and these are the custom headers I'm sending. I'm suggesting that I want the data to be returned in HAL plus JSON. HAL plus JSON is just is plain JSON. You can see here the output, but it comes with some extra metadata, such as, for example, if you have a node with pictures. You will get here in the link section the actual links to the pictures, the URLs to those pictures. So you get some extra metadata, but it's just JSON with something else. And then this setting here, the authorization, these are the authorization headers, and this is what I was saying before. In order to get this string, in PHP you could do enter command line, type PHP-A, so you can enter in interactive mode, and I created a Drupal user in the Drupal interface with username test and password test. So just by calling this encoding function in PHP, you get this. You get this string, and that's it. Drupal can parse this request and know who you are. And well, obviously there are some permissions I need to set to this user, such as, hey, I want this user to be able to request nodes through the REST module. There is a REST module in Drupal 8 that comes by default and lets you build your own API. So it has its own set of permissions that you need to set up previously before giving access to your users. This was basic auth, and this is cookie. For cookie, as I said before, you need to authenticate. So this is how in code, how can we authenticate as a user? We're sending here the username and password, and then Drupal will return a token, which is the session ID, and that's what you need to add on your following request. So first here we're authenticating, And then for the following request we want to make, we already have the token. So that's how Drupal is going to know who we are whenever we are requesting data. And here, for example, we are creating a new node. We are posting something, and we are just, we are creating a new page. And here's the title, and that's it. We can even get a response to see if it worked or not. We are using, in this example, a library called Gazelle. Gazelle is the replacement for Drupal HTTP request from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. There's no Drupal HTTP request. Instead, we're using Gazelle. It's an object-oriented implementation to make HTTP requests. It's much more flexible, it's pluggable, so it's really nice. So here is how we were saying, well, we are loading the cookie plugin because we need to append cookies to this request. This is the host name where we're going to make a request to, and these are the parameters that we want to send to that URL. Actually, no, this is the host name, and this is the path within that host name where we want to send all the data. And here's a link. This is part of the REST module documentation in Drupal 8. So in Contrib, so far we just have OAuth 1. OAuth 1 is the protocol that is used by Twitter and Flickr APIs. There's no OAuth 2 support yet. There is a module called OAuth Server. That's for Drupal 7. That's how you can set up an OAuth server, an OAuth 2 server in Drupal 7. And well, the maintainer said that he's gonna do it. But if anybody wants to help, then you can pretty much use the OAuth module as an example, because the code is not very long, to be honest. This is an example of how OAuth works. OAuth has two different ways. It has two-legged authentication and three-legged authentication. Two-legged authentication is, for example, when you just, let's say you have an API and you want to get some other company to access your API, but you want to be able to know when they are making those requests. So you would go here, create a Drupal user, and enable the OAuth module, and then you get this interface. I mean, this tab at the profile, and when you click Add Consumer, you will get here a consumer key, a consumer secret. Those are the keys you need to send to that particular company to access to your API, because that company will append these two strings to a request, and well, Gazelle has this ability of signing a request with those, because it has to do some encoding with those two parameters plus the data that is being sent, and that's it. That's how it works. There is also the three-legged authentication, which is when you authenticate a user for a website. It's like when you are about to register into a site and you see authenticate with Google. Well, you are taken first to Google, you authenticate yourself, and then you're redirected to that site. That's why it's three-legged authentication. You, the place where you want to access, and the place that is going to authenticate you. So it's not supported yet in Drupal 8. We haven't made it. For the moment, it's just two-legged authentication. This is an example. Again, we're using Gazelle. These two strings would be the ones that we got here. And there is a plugin in Gazelle, which is, this one, OAuth plugin. And that's it. You just need to append them and send it, and automatically Gazelle is going to take care of encoding this request. This would be the response we get, the raw response. This is actually what Gazelle creates. Here's the key. And there are some extra parameters that it's sending just for security. Like, for example, if somebody does any sort of sniffing in your network and gets this request, potentially he could take this same request and make a new request with these same headers. But that's why, for example, OAuth has these nonce, which is it's kind of a the timestamp. It's kind of a way to know when was this request made. So you will store these timestamps, and if you get another request with the same nonce but a different timestamp, that you're being attacked. So you can know if someone is trying to make requests on behalf of someone else on a network. So as I said, as you can see, it's a little bit safer than for example, plain basic auth or just sending a parameter in the URL along with your request. So we're going to get into a little bit deeper to see how this works actually in Drupal 8. we're going to go over a full request. So let's imagine that I built a view. In Drupal 8, you can create views that output JSON or XML. I forgot what's the module. Views export, I think it is, in Drupal 7 that lets you do this. I think it's views export. So I set up this latest news that simply returns the latest news for DrupalCamp Spain. And I require this listing to be authenticated through basic auth. So this is the client, and this is going to be the response from the request. So we had the request, and we got here the authentication header. This would be the encoded username and password. So we get to Drupal. Drupal starts its bootstrapping phases. There's one of these phases where it loads the authentication manager, which gets the request object. And the authentication manager will load all the available authentication providers for this particular request and call this little method. The apply method is just a very quick way to know if any of these authentication providers can authenticate this request. It's done in 2 steps because the next step would be the authenticate. And authenticate normally involves accessing the database. So since this is heavy, that's why we first go over this first step. For example, the apply method of basic auth will check if there is a username and password in the request. That's it. The cookie will see if there is a cookie ID in the request, and this will just return true or false. So in this case, since we have this authorization header, this will return true. So we'll get to the next step, which is the authenticate. We'll get the request object for this method as well. And the authenticate will simply extract the username, extract the password from the request, and then call user authenticate, sending those values and seeing if there is an existing user in the database. In this case, there is an existing user in the database. So the next step, we will move on to the authorization system, which depends. This is a view. So I think that views uses view access controller, which it's just how you set up the view. That's when you, if you ever configure a view through the UI, you will see that there is a section called security or permissions. That's when you say, you can set up there like, this view can be viewed by this role or this particular permission. Well, that's this section. In Drupal 7, this would be, for example, if you're viewing a node, it would be calling node access. If you're viewing a user, it will be calling your user access. It depends on what you are requesting. So in this case, we had permission to see this list of news, so we get a true, and that's when we got to the last step, which is just actually building the response. So handing this user to views, and views will take care of building the response, and we will get well, this would be a JSON response, but I just made it here in text. But we will get a 200 error OK code and the list of news in JSON. From this section, this first bit would be authentication, the club, and this second bit would be the authorization. As you can see, they are clearly separated. This is an example of how basic auth works. This is the first method that we call the applies. As you can see, we just check if there is a username and password, and that's it. We return true. As you can see, there's no database here. So imagine that you have 15 authentication providers. This would be a fast way of for them to check if they're just checking on headers to see if they can authenticate or not. And then when one of these authentication providers return true here, that's when we get to the second step, where we try to extract a user out of the request. And so in this case, we're doing the same thing, plus we are calling user authenticate to see if we can extract a user. So if there is an existing user with this username and password, that's where we're going to get UID, and obviously we will load that user. In Drupal, most of the stuff, it's built on services. A service, it's a class that you just create once, because you need it just normally once, or you don't need that to be created many times during a full bootstrap. So in this case, if I want the basic authentication provider to be discovered by Drupal, I'm implementing this interface. An interface is just like a template. And that this, if you see the source code of this interface, it has an empty applies method and an empty authenticate method, and that's it. And when we're doing here, what we're doing here is that we are, this file, it's defined per module, and these are kind of the services / classes that I have in my module and that I want Drupal to discover automatically. Same as, for example, in Drupal 7, you had the module.info file, and you would add classes there. Like, for example, if you do something with views, you would add that file there, so Drupal would discover it. This is the way that it's done in Drupal 7. This is part of the dependency injection container of Drupal 8. Sorry, I said Drupal 7 before, it's Drupal 8. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm defining this particular service. This is the class where this is located. This path is a virtual path. It's part of PSR 0. That's going to change to PSR 4. I cannot get into details with that because that's out of the scope, but it's just a way for Drupal to discover where this is within my module. These are the arguments that it needs, and this is the important bit. By tagging this service with authentication provider, I'm going to show you some code afterwards. The authentication manager will get to a step that it says, Drupal, give me all these services that have this tag. So that's how it discovers this. And the priority lets you, for example, define a few authentication providers to support a particular request, and which one should run first. So, for example, I may decide, okay, so I want this particular route to be authenticated through OAuth and basic auth. But OAuth is more important for me. I want OAuth to go first. So that's when I would play with the priority. This is how it works in core. This is the authentication, this is the authentication manager. And what it does is it will load first this authentication manager. This is one of the passes. There are many classes like this in Drupal 8, which are like the different steps during the bootstrap. And this particular step, what we're doing is we're loading the authentication manager. We are loading all these services that have this particular tag, authentication provider. This is what we're seeing here. This will return a list of loaded objects, and that's it. We are We are adding each of these authentication providers to the matcher. The matcher is authentication manager. So basically, we're just creating an array of all the authentication providers that are available, and then that we're going to pass on that array to the bit of the code that takes care of authenticating a request. So some examples, practical examples about how can you do that with Drupal 8. First one would be, how can you authenticate an existing route? In Drupal 7, this would be implementing hook menu alter and changing the index array called auth callback or authentication access callback. It's the one. So you would implement your own function there, and that has to return true or false, and that's it. In this case, there is no hook menu alter in Drupal 8. It's an event that you need to subscribe to with a class, and it's called onAlterRoute. So it's more or less the same thing, but instead of being a hook, it's an event. Events come from Symfony. The events are not Drupalisms are as hooks are, which is great because you may see events in other technologies such as Symfony, jQuery, AngularJS. So it's part of this initiative of going through best practices that we are doing in Drupal 8. So this particular example, we're going to alter the /contact page, adding authentication, basic auth. So obviously nobody's going to be able to to send us support requests. So that's a module that is in GitHub. The slides are in the session description, by the way, if you want to play around with some of this code. And this is basically what it's doing. So this would be what we would do in Drupal 7 with hook menu alter. We are defining this class that extends from a helper class called route subscriber base that sets some defaults and listens to this particular event on alter routes. And it has this function, this method called alter routes, which will get a collection parameter, which is basically the module name, and sorry, the list of routes and the provider, which is the module name. So for each of the available modules that I have in Drupal 8, I will get into here. So let's say that this runs kind of in a for loop. And for each of the modules, I'll get a collection of all the routes that this module has defined. So for example, what I'm looking for here is the contact module. So that's one I'll wait until we get into to the contact module. Once we get into the contact module, I know that the /contact page route has this ID. So that's how I'm loading that route. And I'm saying here that I want this particular route to be authenticated through basic auth. This is the authentication bit. And then next comes authorization. I'm making a requirement that this route can only be accessed by authenticated users, which means that this bit should return a user. If it returns null or an anonymous user, this may not pass. So I'll get a 403. And that's it. Last step is adding back the route to the collection of routes. And that's it. That's how you make it. As well, again, you need to make this class a service. So I'm creating here yet another service within this testing module. And I'm subscribing to the event subscriber. The event subscriber is a Symfony component that will shout like, hey, this is the moment to alter the routes. Hey, this is the moment to shut down all the processing. All of the different hooks, many of the hooks that we had in Drupal 7 are now events, and they are handed by the event subscriber. So when we access /contact, that's when we see this fancy pop-up saying username and password. So here is where we could set, for example, test and test in order to access if we had the user with username test and password test. For a custom route, when you are defining your own route, you can do it. This would be the route definition. This is actually what it's hook menu in Drupal 7, and in Drupal 8, it's split. You need to define this YAML file called routing, where you define the routes and the authentication and the authorization, and which is the class and method that is going to take care. This will be the callback function that takes care of returning a response. So here we are saying that this particular route, this is actually taken from a test module used for testing in Drupal 8 core. We're saying that this route can only be accessed through basic auth, and we also again need an authenticated user. Authorization, authentication. And as for a REST resource, REST is a protocol for creating an API. And there is a REST module in Drupal 8. So by default, you just activate REST, just start clicking around, and you have an API built, which is great. In Drupal 8, in Drupal 7, you have REST WS, you have also services module. So it's kind of more tricky because there are many alternatives, and not all of them are great for building an API, but they work. So this is a particular resource for REST. Yet again, another YAML file. What we're defining here is we are saying that nodes can be accessed through get method, and they can return a response in JSON, HAL JSON, or XML, and they support these two authentication methods, OAuth or basic auth. So if any of these two return a user, then it's fine. And this is part of the official documentation from the REST module in Drupal.org. I highly recommend this reading. There is also this is through code. You would have to write this by hand in Drupal. Yep, 10 minutes, okay. In Drupal 8, but there is a Contrib module for Drupal 8 already, which is called REST UI, that you will get all the entity types, and you just need to check. Like, hey, I want to list, for example, users, and I want to allow the creation of users through post method, and I'm going to support these formats and this authentication provider. So it's pretty easy to set up an API this way, just by clicking around the user interface. The last one, it's authenticating a view. So normally views are set up through the user interface. You just click around. And I was playing around with a view, and I thought, okay, so this is the authorization. Here I'm saying that I want an authenticated user. And in this example, I am building, let's say that we want to create a view that lists all the unpublished content. Obviously, we don't want the unpublished content to be available to everyone. So what we're doing here is that we have defined this requirement. I want to list unpublished content. Here in the format, I'm saying that I want to use the serializer because I want to return JSON. This is, as you can see here, this is not a page, it's not a block, it's a REST export. And so REST module takes care of displaying the output of this view. And it will return a JSON feed with all of the unpublished content. But there's no authentication, and there is nothing in the UI here for supporting it. So there are two ways you can do that. Again, we can create yet another class that extends from this route, and when we get to views module, the way I figure this out is I just typed a DPM here to see what the hell I was getting, and the thing is that views for each of your views will create a route called view. This is the machine name of your view, and this would be the display within that view. So this page one, it's this. It's just doing it that way. I don't really know why, because this is not a page display. It's a REST export, but it doesn't really matter. It's just an example. So when we get to this point, we will do the same thing as we did before with the other example: setting authentication, setting authorization, save again the view. That's it. Problem is that you set up views through the user interface, clicking around, but then you have this piece of code somewhere else. In the future, most probably, if you change the view, you will forget about this, or you will forget where this is. So it's much better if this is handed through the user interface. So there is a patch right now for Drupal core that adds authentication here. If you click here, you will get a pop-up with all the available authentication providers, so you can just click which ones should be supported, and that's it. The patch is working and ready. It just needs to have the tests updated. There are some failing tests, and then we need to add some further test coverage for this to get in. But I'm hoping that this will get in before we get to a stable release. It's just the testing bit that is needed. By the way, the link is there in case you want to see about jump in and give a hand, because there's not much left to do here before this is ready to go. And this is the example. I'm again using dev HTTP client. This is the path of the view. I want JSON. This is my testing user I created at the start. And here it is. This is the output of the view with all the unpublished content. So from here, pending things to do. We need to add float support to OAuth. The float system, it's, how are we going on time? How much time do I have left? Time? 5 minutes, okay. And this is the last one. So float, it's, you may have seen this when, for example, you try to log into a site like 5 or 6 times and you type your password wrong, and the system says, you're blocked for 15 minutes. Well, that's the float system. So this is actually done. I didn't update this slide. We added float support to OAuth. Basic auth has also float support, but we are thinking about making this generic, because every authentication provider that you create may need this, because if you don't add this, I could perfectly create a script that tries to authenticate all the time, sending different parameters until it finds a match. So it's a security measure. And then there are many more authentication providers to implement, such as OAuth 2, digest authentication. Perhaps some people will need IP-based authentication. I don't know, it sounds weird, but some people told me that if it was possible, so that's why I'm adding it here. And then your own authentication system, whatever is your policy. So any questions? Okay, thank you very much.